Gloriana, An Intimate Portrait of Queen Elizabeth I, by Rory Bourke. Part 1. The Chess Pieces. The Renaissance tyrant, the fifth of the great Tudor dynasty to rule all England, regarded her subjects as one might survey a chessboard. Good Queen Bess, but much more than that was she. Greater than any king, and with a heart and a stomach to match her dread sire, the mighty Henry VIII, whose glance alone had commanded obedience and absolute loyalty. Her father had been one, she reflected, whose passions and appetites could equal any Plantagenet king before him. The Plantagenet passion, mixed with the Tudor cool-headed, calculating self-interest, was something she knew she had inherited in equal measure, each side at war with the other. Each side like twins competing for mastery within her. In an effort to quell these passions, her tutors had drummed into her the notion of self-discipline and scholarly excellence, as well as adherence to the true Protestant religion. She had worked hard on this. Her knowledge could equal Erasmus, and she could defeat any man with her tongue if not with the lance. Would that she had been a man, that she could shift for herself in battle like a king, but she was a woman. Yet being a woman she could yet defeat them all, though the greatest enemy of all, herself, still lay unvanquished. The flesh must be defeated. She could have wielded a sword like a champion had she been a boy, and permitted to enter the lists and joust in tournaments like her adored father. Oh, she would have made him beam with pride if he could just see her, a lioness to rule England. Still, she could have comported herself with honor on any battlefield or field an army if she chose. She could fight in armor and charge an enemy on horseback, though this was not generally known, but she had learned these manly and knightly skills privately from her father, the late king, who had taught her himself. She could also dance, she could sing. Like her father, she was a musician, played the lute passing well, and she had written poems. She could converse in Latin and discuss the finer points of theology and history, science, or mathematics, to put any scholar or papist to shame. She could speak French and German fluently and Spanish well enough to impress the ambassador and make his attendants blush. She was a true Renaissance prince. Her intellect and her intelligence was everything, but her greatest weakness, as she well knew, was herself. Her heart. She fought it day and night, her last unconquered dominion. She was empress of all but this. It was essential that her head rule her heart. She was considered beautiful as Bathsheba, yet wise as Solomon. Beauty she could take or leave, and men had never been inattentive, but wisdom, that was everything. Her ancestor, King Henry II Bourke, had not been so wise, but a man governed by his passions. He, in one of his celebrated rages, had ordered the murder, one terrible evening after dinner, of his best friend, Thomas à Becket, as her tutors had informed her. At the king's command, as he lay apoplectic on the floor, screaming for vengeance, biting the very rushes that covered it, the death sentence was pronounced. 6 of his most trusted knights had quietly left the table and ridden silently to Canterbury. There at midnight, before the high altar of the cathedral, they had carried out their grisly work. The bloody sacrilege beneath the golden crucifix. They smote him again and again like Caesar at Pompey's statue, until the archbishop's blood spilled out on the cold flagstones. His brains addled by a sword as he lay stricken before the blessed sacrament. The king rued it, and did penance for the rest of his life. Underneath his imperial velvet robes he wore, it was said, a common hair shirt, and before the altar in his private chapel every night and morning he flagellated himself, to atone, as if he ever could, for the most heinous dreadful crime ever committed by a king. God's vicegerent on earth, a crime for which, like King David, who caused the murder of his most trusted friend, to hide his lust with Bathsheba, he was cursed by God. Poor Beauclerk knew he could never be forgiven, and that, by his own actions, he had called down destruction, not just upon himself and his heirs, but the curse of the Most High upon his very dynasty. He bore the mark of Cain forever. Henry Beauclerk was a clear example of this terrible plague of the flesh, which she, Elizabeth, had inherited. This curse had been passed down by kings. Hundreds of years of war and bloody constraint, death, murder, regicide. Edward II murdered with a red-hot poker inserted in his fundament, so that no outward marks of violence might appear on his corpse. Richard II deposed and later murdered, as he lay in prison at Pontefract. Richard of York killed in battle. Poor mad Henry VI smothered in the Tower. Edward IV, who died of a seizure brought on by his love of wine and women. And Clarence, who was drowned in a butt of Malmsey wine. The little princes murdered, as they slept in the Tower. It was said by all, by Richard III, her great-uncle slain by her grandfather's men. Cut to pieces as he lay in the mud crying treason. For despite all the propaganda, Elizabeth knew the truth of Bosworth, and what had really happened at Redmoor Plain. Also she knew what had befallen the little boys as they slept in the Tower. It was not by her great-uncle as the chroniclers had written, but by the will of her great-grandmamma Margaret the Queen Mother, and at the hands of her puppet, the Duke of Buckingham. Richard's body was bludgeoned and hacked to pieces after the battle, and his bruised, battered body stripped naked hung over a horse. His exposed buttocks stabbed by a jeering soldier of her grandfather as they crossed back into Leicester. His body was buried with little ceremony in a small friary. Thus the curse of Beauclerk, the curse of kings and the poisoned crown had seen its fulfillment and worked out its bloody course. But for the treachery of the Stanleys at Bosworth intervening at the last minute on her grandfather's behalf, she knew only too well that her line would have been snuffed out, and that she would never have existed. She still might fall, whether by rebellion or by an assassin's hand. Her family were usurpers as well, she knew, and she must keep her throne or lose her head. Trust no one. Least of all herself and her passion. Passion was the downfall of her great-grandfather Edward IV, the son of York, who died in his bed at the age of 40 years. Lust, passion, murder, rage, the plague of princes, the curse of the crown, enemies within as enemies without, she pondered. Plantagenet and Tudor blood intermingled, and the Queen knew it. She could feel the writhing demons and passions within her. They had to be conquered. She must rule herself or not rule at all. She was of that famous stock. She was Gloriana, whose eyes constantly darted around the length and breadth of her presence chamber, scrutinizing the faces of her courtiers as they bowed and scraped before her. Who was loyal, who was not? But she was also, she reflected, a weak and feeble woman, not so weak. Not so feeble, she snorted angrily to herself, but let the fools think it if they must, for at times it served her purpose. Elizabeth was every inch her mighty father's daughter. Robert Lord Dudley, the Queen's favourite, the powerful and ambitious Earl of Leicester, did not bow but instead looked at her steadily as he swept off his hat and went down on one knee, never once taking his eyes from hers. A little too bold, perhaps, she thought, but then she melted as he held her gaze with his. Lovely sweet Robin, she thought to herself as her eyes rested on his handsome face. Ah, love! She sighed as remembrance of his kisses softened her heart. She smiled at him as he knelt before her, and he smiled back, beaming at her. How she loved him! How she adored the way he had held her at La Volta. Ah, by Christ, that man had good legs, and could he dance! And then in her bedchamber, he would come to her later, and she would spread out on the counterpane, her body all his once more. No more the Empress but his to command as she gave herself to him body and soul. Oh, but by God, she wanted him now! Send them away, send them all away, and let her take him back to bed at once. Let them call me the Virgin Queen if they must, she thought. Let others think it for the good of the realm. Oh, that she could have her wonderful gallant Robin by her side, and how many, many times had he begged her to marry him. Oh, God, would that I could have Robin forever, and tell that smelly pox-ridden Spanish King Philip Habsburg to fuck off back to Madrid. Ha ha, Francis singed. His beard well at Cadiz, she thought with humor, though in public she had appeared outraged and shocked, and denied all knowledge and responsibility for it. Mendoza, the Spanish ambassador, had been furious, bordering on rude. However, even he would not dare to publicly insult Elizabeth in her own country. She had placated him, promising him that all offenders would be punished, and sent him back to his master, if not satisfied, at least for the time being mollified. But privately she had congratulated Drake, and knighted him on the spot, as he knelt before her, and she drank with him. How they had laughed about it! She would need him soon. His Most Catholic Majesty would soon require satisfaction for his insult, but she must yet play them all a little longer. She feared that the Pope might soon issue a bull of excommunication against her, urging all loyal Catholic princes to wage war on England and its Protestant Queen as a holy crusade. All Catholics would be blessed by the Pope and given dispensation to kill her. She needed friends now more than ever. And there were rumors. Rumors, and more than rumors, of treason. Plots. Popish plots and uprisings in the north. Worst of all, her troublesome wayward cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, currently a royal prisoner at Fotheringhay Castle. A rival and rallying point for her throne, and not only an inspiration for the treacherous rebellious Scots, but much of northern Catholic England, who had little cause to love her a Protestant queen. What to do about her cousin Mary? What to do indeed? Always a question she wanted to put far from her mind, though it haunted her. She must act, but she would not. She knew what she must do, what she did not want to do in her wildest nightmares. She would put it off as long as she could. The idea was vile to her soul. And she knew only too well the repercussions of such a terrible act. One that might not just turn the whole world against her, where England already stood alone, but re-invoke the terrible curse of kings that had been passed down to her. Elizabeth's mind drew itself away from these dark thoughts to more exciting distractions. Her court, like a pleasant garden, now had many bright flowers to adorn it, and she had cleared out the briars and weeded it well. She had surrounded herself with bravos, much to Lord Cecil's dismay. She laughed to herself. There had been too many boring, stuffy old men in it before. She loved these young bloods who freshened her court like Greek gods, and who were so delightful to look upon. And she loved Drake too, a great sea captain, a pirate really, but she liked pirates. Though he was a little older, and especially the younger dashing Sir Walter Raleigh, who had brought her exotic presents from the New World. She fancied him too, not a little, that elegant, charming young man with his cutthroat smile. But her whole heart belonged to Robin. Her sweet Robin, true love of her life. Yet love was not for princes, she reflected, as the latest ambassador from the Netherlands stepped forward and bowed low before her. No indeed, she reflected, as the Queen, now all business, nodded gravely and courteously, but suppressing a slight smile, and the rising giggles at the stammering Dutchman, who was obviously terrified. She couldn't wait to tell Robin later, she thought to herself. But then her face hardened again, as she remembered who she was and who she must be. For she was a prince, and love was not for princes, she remembered, as her father of famous memory had taught her only too well. Her father, whom she had loved and hero worshipped, yet feared too. He had taught her well, and so had her mother, whose foolishness in love, and unable to bear her husband, a son, had brought her so swiftly to the scaffold. Trust no one. Well, her sister Mary had taught her that too. She'd nearly been executed herself. She knew what it was to languish as a terrified, unwilling guest in the sumptuous royal apartments of the Tower. She'd fought hard for her throne, and she wasn't going to lose it now. The monarch's face beneath her pale mask froze into iconic majesty as her eyes narrowed and hardened. She must talk to Walsingham. At least she could trust him, though his methods made her shudder. Nevertheless, she reflected, treason must be found out. Traitors must be rooted out and stamped out. Made an example of. Her head must rule her heart. The safety of her throne, and indeed the very security of the realm, as well as her religion and the lives of her subjects, depended on nothing less than this. The queen must never marry. Her head must reign over all, lest reign at all.